about the origins. First of all, I have to talk about the context of the times, what was happening in the 60s and the 70s in Australia. Well, it was a global phenomenon. We felt we were part of something much bigger. There was a kind of a youth culture, which was like 90% marketing. But when the US started another war with their invasion of Indochina, of Vietnam, and then the Australian government introduced conscription, that is, compulsory joining of the army for all 19-year-olds whose birthday was pulled out of a barrel at random. That transformed the youth movement into a radical anti-war social change movement. And then this was general. The music at the time, the Beatles, all that kind of stuff, were the context with this is happening. There are also social factors to be considered. Marijuana at that time was just the purvey of a few radicals, anarchists at the fringes, and sailors. They used to smoke the rope. The rope was made from hemp. That's why it was called, the crime at the time was possession of hemp, possession of a rope that you'd get on the docks. But then it came along, Aldous Huxley and Doors of Perception, this idea of changing perception. The way into spiritual enlightenment was through psychedelic drugs. And lysergic acid, LSD, took off around the world. It had great advocates. But at my university, the University of New South Wales, it was being manufactured in the chemistry labs by postgraduate students. So it was freely available on the campuses. And it had huge effect on the way people began to see the world and span off. So that led to investigation of magic mushrooms, which becomes a factor in coming north later on. So we have this ferment, to end the war in Vietnam, to end conscription. And if you're a student at university in those days, you would have been 18, 19. You would have been right onto this, because if your name was pulled out of the barrel, then as soon as you finish your degree, into the army and off to the Vietnam. And it wasn't easy. 500 were killed in Vietnam. Most of these, and I'm talking about 90%, were conscripts. And most of these, the deaths, were caused by explosions, mine explosions, soldiers standing on mines. And whose mines were they? Australian mines. We'd actually planted the mines. The Viet Cong had come along at night with knives, finding the mine and replacing it, so that people were blown up. It was a disaster. The whole war was a disaster. We'd followed America, the US, into Vietnam, and it proved to be a huge disaster. So in 1966, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the first president ever to come to Australia, arrives in Sydney. And he's met with a protest. We're small. But at the time I was president of the Labour Club at the University of New South Wales. And the Labour Club was the most radical club on campus. And we decided we'd organise a reception. We called this meeting, I called the meeting, called the Welcome LBJ Committee. And it was like a little notice at the entrance of the union when it resulted in 300 people squeezing into a room about twice the size of this to start talking about what we could do in response to Lyndon Baines Johnson's visit. And why was he coming to Australia? An election was coming up, and the Liberal Party, the coalition that's now in power, back then was running a campaign. The old Prime Minister Menzies had been in power for 25 years. There was a new leadership. They felt a bit threatened, and they were running on a campaign of all the way with LBJ. That is, we would go to any war and pay any price to stay alongside the US, in the US alliance. So we students were saying, we don't want to have any of this. Yeah? So we organised a protest, and we managed to stop the motorcade when it went through Sydney. Right? Dramatic event at the time. I was one of the guys under the car, right? So that my antecedents. We managed to stop the motorcade. The election came. It was a landslide, right, in favour of the Liberal government. You know? The anti-war movement would appear to have been crushed in 1966, but we kept working, and by 1971, so we're talking just 5 years later, we've got massive protests happening. They were called the moratoriums. Hundreds of thousands of people coming out in the streets protesting against the war. Yeah? Such that in 1972, the ALP Whitlam government's elected in November 72. Right? And it's a landslide for Whitlam at the time. It's the end. There's been a complete reversal of the public's attitude to war. And who led this? Well, the unions were involved actively. What was left of the Communist Party at the time was actively involved. But far and away, this was a student movement, organised and peopled by the students. So if you were living in digs, as you used to say, student accommodation, shared house, or a university in Sydney in those days, or Melbourne or Brisbane, protest was part of your social life, you know? You'd read about a protest, hey, there's a demo on, and the whole household would go out and be part of it. It was like going to a social event, you know, more than a political event. It was really tough in Brisbane, you know? They had to crush the protests there. Any assembly at that time was broken up by the cops. You had to be brave. But in Melbourne and Sydney, much more a social event, yeah? It was part of the culture. Well, I was part of that. I'd been to Duntroon. I went from high school to Royal Military College and had dropped out before going to university. So I had an idea of what the army was on about and what was happening. And I was really concerned, yeah, we all were, that what we were being prepared for as students, as engineering students and things like that, was perpetual war. You know, that we were being geared up for a society which would be at war. Yeah? So when we won, yeah, and we did win, we brought down the government, right? We had a new future in front of us. And this is the context in which the Aquarius Festival happens here. The Aquarius Festival was produced by the Australian Union of Students. The Australian Union of Students at that time was collecting 55 cents, I think it was, from every university student across Australia. So we had a lot of money in those days. It was a lot of money, $50,000, wow. We had staff, the Australian Union of Students, and organising capacity. All of this has been crushed, like I must say. It doesn't exist today. But in those days, the Australian Union of Students was powerful. And for example, when the Whitlam government was elected, the Australian Union of Students' policy on education was taken holus bolus and put into practice by the Whitlam government. The creation of the Schools Commission at that time was a recommendation from the Australian Union of Students, right? AUS also had a cultural arm. It was rich enough to support It was rich enough to support a cultural division, and that consisted of travelling shows around intervarsity shows and organising this biennial cultural festival that used to happen in May. In those days, the universities were 3 terms rather than 2 semesters. Yeah. So the May vacation was when you did things. You went off to camps and things like that. In 1971, the Aquarius Festival was held on the campus of the Australian National University in Canberra. And what distinguished this festival from other ones, although all the program of intervarsities was there, they would collect all the drama clubs from around the country and do performances, debating, choral, any particular cultural aspect of campus life in those days would be represented in the Australian Union of Students. But what happened in Canberra was that when the students came together, kind of critical mass, what they wanted to do was protest. So on the campus, they had their program, you know, all the theatres and things were occupied with cultural events. But in the union, a food cooperative was created. Students started cooking and sharing food. And every day there'd be a political debate, a big meeting, and a march off to some target, right? South African embassy, the US embassy. Every day a protest. Now I was at this event tripping on acid, you know, thinking how amazing it was, you know, what was happening here. And what I realised was that the program had become irrelevant. Yeah? What was happening? The culture of students at the time was protest. Now that was terrific in creating cultural change, but it wasn't. It was reactive. You know, it was reacting to symbols. What did we want? We knew what we didn't want by this time, but what sort of society did we want to build? Yeah. So after this event, I wrote a critique of the festival, suggesting one of the best things we could do with it would be to take it off campus, right? Take it away from the cities and the university campuses where students were in reaction, and place it somewhere neutral where we have to look inwards and find out what sort of future we wanted. Right? And this is in the context of me now having graduated in engineering, now being a sociology student. Sociology was the buzz course in those days. Trying to understand how communities work and how they change was my challenge. How do communities change? What I was seeing was that this resistance to the war had produced a counterculture. I read a book at the time called The Making of a Counterculture, you should write this down, by Theodore Roszak. The Making of a Counterculture, and the subtitle was Where the Wasteland Ends. So it wasn't just war we were concerned at the time, we were also seeing the effects of industrial pollution. I used to ride a motorbike to university through the city, and the sky would be brown with pollution. There was a book written at the time about insecticides called Silent Spring, the effect that DDT was having on bird life. You know, the shells were so fragile that birds were becoming extinct. They couldn't replicate anymore. Big concern about environment things was just beginning, but it was there. So where the wasteland ends, you know, just resonated with me, because this is what was being created, an industrial wasteland of war. Yeah? So all these general concerns, but it began to manifest in various ways. And I was editor of the paper in 1971, quite by accident. I began to investigate this, finding out what the themes of this were. Someone's determined. And each edition had a guest editor, and explored one of the themes of this new culture that was emerging. Now, we were interested in anti-psychiatry, we were interested in anti-war, we were interested in food, for example, organic healing, alternative technologies, and this word alternative began to arrive. We were looking at new ways of doing it. It began to be called the alternative culture, or the counterculture, you know? Something that was in reaction. So the thesis I proposed to the Australian Indian students was that we organise the festival without a program, yeah, and invite all these aspects of the counterculture to assemble at the site and see what community we created out of that. Right? This was the motivation behind looking for an alternative, you know, looking for a different place to do this biennial festival. Now, the guy I developed these ideas with his name Johnny Allen, and after we had a walk, he was living at DY in Sydney, we went for a walk on the beach and we talked about this, and I went away and wrote the essay, sent him a copy. It got published in the national newspaper, and I forgot about it. So did he. But then at this opportunity, I took up a teaching job. Teaching was going terribly for me, and I got a call from Australian Union of Students saying, why don't you apply for the job? It's being advertised as director of the Aquarius Festival. Okay, I'll do that. They flew me down to Sydney, I got interviewed, I got the job, and they said, there were two positions advertised. One was the director of the Aquarius Foundation, and we were appointing this guy called Johnny Allen. So it was like a gift. You know? The two guys who had come up with these ideas were suddenly given the resources to pull it off. So that's the context in which the Aquarius Festival happens. It's a time of radical cultural change, and we set out as radicals to get these radical influences in different aspects of the culture concentrated in temporary community for the Aquarius Festival. It was 10 days, in May. So how was Nimbin chosen? Well, the first thing was that we wanted to get it off the campus and we wanted to camp, yeah? So we wanted to go far north as we could to make it easy and comfortable. May is cold in Melbourne, I can tell you that. So we started looking, first of all, in the northern rivers. In fact, we went, from when we got the approval from the Australian Union of Students conference in August, we drove from the conference north, and the only contact we had northern New South Wales, I've got to say, we could have gone into Queensland except for the Premier at the time, Belky Joe Peterson, who was anti-student. Now we knew if we tried to produce anything in Queensland, we'd have obstacles. So we thought northern New South Wales is as far as we need to go. It's warm enough there, and we'd heard about some sort of countercultural movement up here. And the only contact we had was in Mullumbimby. A guy called Col James had bought up an old logging camp that considered something at the top of Main Arm Valley, and it consisted of something like 5 houses. So they had a ready-made community once they bought this. Well, we drove directly there, arrived just on sunset, and said, you know, knock on the door, and where these guys would come to, hey, I can think you are. It's like, we got a hostile reception. Right from the beginning, Col James didn't want to know anything about what we were doing. So he said, no way will I let you produce this festival in the Main Arm Valley. I'll tell all the locals about the terrible things you're going to do when you come to settling. I know because I've been a hippie too. Yeah? So we packed up the next morning. We were exhausted. We stayed overnight. They let us stay there overnight. The next morning before we left, he came and said, well, if you're going to look for some place to do it, I recommend you look in the Nimbin Valley, which is over the range. Check it out. Property, real estate properties over there is cheap, and as far as I know, there are no hippies there. Right? And the other thing he said before leaving was that, oh, there's another fellow you ought to talk to. His name's Paul Joseph. He was living on this community, and he's been talking about a festival. I said, that's interesting. Where's Paul? And he said, oh, he's living over at Palmwoods, around the corner there. He gave me directions there. So we went from Col James' place in that morning, around the Palmwoods, following the directions, which led up this hill till the road ran out, to a banana shed at the top of the ridge. And there was this hippie, glorious, looking like a yogi, an Indian yogi. Said he had very few, he had like a blanket to sit on, you know, water container and a little bit of food. But there he was meditating on the top of a mountain. I thought, what have we come to here? It's fantastic. So he shared our vision of what we had in mind for the Aquarius Festival, and Paul literally rolled up his bedding and hopped in the car and came with us and became the party. So there was the 3 principals then, Johnny Allen, myself, and Paul Joseph, and my partner, that's 4, Vi Turl, who was the Cultural Affairs Officer at the University of New England in Armidale, set out looking for the site. And it turned out not to be easy to find a place for the festival. And part of that was that we weren't clear, we were confused about the kind of place we wanted. Paul was pumping for a piece of land which would become communal property after the festival. So the festival would buy the land, yeah? So part of the search was a place with a river that we could swim in, right? Swimming naked was a thing that hippies did at the time. And a place that we could buy. Well, I searched all over the north. I put ads in the Northern Star, got no responses to anyone wanting to host a festival on their property. Absolutely nothing. And started going to real estates, travelling, and it was the most depressing thing. I'd go and walk these bits of land. And I remember visiting one north of Nimbin. And by this time, I had a lot of interest. We were selling the festival at the same time, you know. We had groups preparing to go there, eager to find out what this site would be. So there was a lot of pressure on me to secure the site. And I got the offer of the help of a guy called P.A. Yeomans. And he was a leader in the theory of keyline farming, how to efficiently use water on your property. And he offered to come with me. Now, this guy was an important agricultural specialist, taking time out to hop up this idea. And we went to have a look at a property together north of him. And what was extraordinary about this property were two things. One was that there were no trees. Right? Like the whole property had been cleared to the boundary. Okay? That was not something we wanted. Right? And the other thing, so we looked inside the house and there was a cat on every horizontal surface. Right? It was a cattery this side. And these demented old Nimbinites, right, trying to sell the property to us. I was depressed by this, and I felt I'd failed, wasted P.A. Yeoman's time. So I came back into Nimbin, and I went to the public telephone. We didn't have mobiles, to make a call to the architect students, a fellow called Col James, who was a senior tutor at the architect school at Sydney, and he'd offered to be the site manager, to get the site ready. So I said, well, Col, I failed again. I haven't found anything. I've got nothing to suggest. He said, Graeme, we're running out of time. Maybe we shouldn't be looking for a piece of land, a greenfield site where we have to put in infrastructure like water supply and drainage and toilets. Maybe we should be looking for something that's already there, like a showgrounds. I said, no. I just had a look around Nimbin and it's got a great showground down there that seemed to have a lot of facility. I said, well, maybe we should check that out. So I went down to the Nimbin from the telephone box, got the telephone number off the for hire board down at the showgrounds, rang it up and said, we're interested in hiring the showgrounds. And they said, oh, happy to meet you. So I organised a meeting time that involved Col James coming up from Sydney to visit Nimbin. And we parked in the main street of Nimbin, in Cullen Street, opposite the post office, and they were waiting for us at the War Memorial, the show society, the A&I Society committee. And we walked up the middle of the street towards them, And I tell you that detail because that's how empty the streets were. There was no traffic, There were about 3 cars parked in the street at the time. Anyway, I had this conversation and we were, striding up. It was like high noon, the meeting of these two cultures. The radical counterculture meets conservative show society in Nimbin. And we had a very productive meeting. They were eager to earn some money for the show society and hire it out. But when they got to understand the dimensions of the event, how big this could be, they thought, well, we ought not do this without Nimbin community support. Yeah? So let's organise a community meeting. And the show society agreed to host it. Fred Cullen, the family after the main street and stuff, was the chairman of this meeting. So we came back to Nimbin in January, after the Christmas holidays, after the break, to organise this public meeting. There was a whole tribe of us. People came down from Brisbane, people came up from Sydney, and we sold the community. I went around, we produced it, so you can get these publications, went around and talked to everyone in the community that might have an interest in this festival. I talked to the baker, I talked to the vicar, I talked to the shopkeepers, the real estate agent, and in particular I talked to the cop at the time. And Nimbin was one cop police station. I'm trying to remember his name. It's so important to the story and I can't remember. Bob Bus, the bus service. Bob. Nimbin buses. He was going around. Bob, anyway, we'll call him Bob. Constable Bob. And Bob was an entrepreneur, And the context for Nimbin was that in the beginning of that year there'd been a Four Corners program about rural recession, and they'd chosen Nimbin, of all places, to show the effect of the rural recession in Australia. And this national publicity for Nimbin being a town that was going backwards offended the local people. Because you have to understand the context of Nimbin is that it was only settled in the 1890s. In 1920, the area had its peak butter year. It was all downhill from the 1920s. That is, in those 30 years, they'd come here, they'd bought their blocks of land by selection off a map in Sydney, come here, cut down the forest, the big scrub, looked around for an industry that would work. They chose butter production and built the butter factories all around the district as cooperatives, right? Working together, yeah? And produced a viable community. They built their own school. This was not a government-built school up the hill there. It was a citizen initiative. The citizens built the school. They built the hall. The hall was the first thing they built, actually. Yeah. So it was a very, in the 1890s through the 1820s, you had this dynamic community that was out there pioneering, creating a new future for themselves. The common market knocks butter off the agenda and it kind of collapses, right? It's as if the community has lost confidence. But Bob Marsh had a vision that could revive. So he had a pet food, besides being a policeman, he had his own business down at the butter factory, the old butter factory, just getting dead cows and cutting them up for pet food, And he thought this was a wonderful opportunity, so he threw his support behind it. So we had this dramatic meeting of the cultures, right, in the Nimbin Hall, where all the people came in. Only one dissenting voice was asked. What about drugs? And we were upfront about this, saying, well, look, this is not a Sunday school picnic, There is a drug culture. It's part of the student culture. There are going to be marijuana, you can expect this, acid, but it won't be major. That's not the point of the festival. So it was the only dissenting voice. The thing that really won the meeting was Bob Marsh's statement. He couldn't be there in person, but he wrote a letter saying how he thought important this opportunity was. And so it was that it was passed they would support the festival and it would be a joint venture, right? It would be the village putting on a festival in conjunction with the university students, right? It's important to understand that tends to be forgotten. That was actually, they went out of their way. At the time, the village of Nimbin had the Australian champion tug-of-war team, yeah? It was these foresters, the guys, the loggers, had strong arms and strong legs, and also the banana farmers walking up those things. Eric Bazana, just in big men, and their pet rivals, Rapville. So Rapville and Nimbin used to pull off regularly, and great fights. So they decided their contribution was to organise a sports day as part of the festival. Yeah, be held at the showgrounds. These things came to pass, They invited Doug Anthony, right? Doug Anthony was Deputy Prime Minister at the time. He's a local member here, right? Based in Wollongbar, part of the Anthony dynasty over there, property family. He came to Nimbin and was part of the festival. Such was the goodwill that had been created for the festival at the time. So it was a citizen of them. Where did it come from? We put it to them. Right? We put it to the show society put it to the community, and we had all-round acceptance for this festival as a joint venture. Yeah? Australian Union of Students and etc. Any questions? What kind of events took place? Well, the first thing to understand is there was no program. We went out of our way to say the festival will be what people bring to it, right? It'll be your culture that's reflected there. But we had means of doing. We seeded it with things, of course. We set up a stage where the Heddersfield is at present. Yeah. We rented that land behind the village. We tried to get this block of land too, but the woman who owned it didn't like hippies. She was determined we wouldn't have this side of the village as well. So we got another bit of land out along Gungus Road, between the road and the creek, which was the major camping area, plus the showground on the other side. So we had a connection through there. I think it's important to say that we're also avoiding being another Woodstock festival. Yeah. Woodstock Festival had happened 2 years before. It was a major phenomenon for the counterculture, that this youth culture could gather in such numbers that it created a national emergency. Like it blocked the roads, and then it rained, and everything was mud and all this kind of stuff. And if you read the story of that, it was the hippies, in particular the yippies, Abbie Hoffman. These were the major spokespeople against the war in the US, organising student resistance to the war. It was they who saved the festival from disaster. They put in the services that the entrepreneurs from the music industry couldn't even think about it. It was they who broke down the gates to make it a free festival, yeah? So they could operate more freely. But in the end, it was a music festival. It was all about big egos with big amplifiers on a big stage playing to a passive audience. Yeah? There was a bit of dancing, but basically it was a one-way festival. And we said, by this time we'd had enough of the music industry. There had been festivals, a Rimba Festival down in Sydney, the Sunbury Festival, where the music industry had replicated the Woodstock phenomenon of the big stage with the big egos, right? We said, no, this is a counterculture festival. We will not pay any rock and roll, people. If you want to come and play rock and roll, great, but we're not going to pay for you, yeah? And that made it difficult, yeah? Because rock and roll at that time, they had all these overheads because of the equipment, the PAs and all this thing they had to buy. They couldn't do free gigs, yeah? So effectively we were saying no to the music industry at the time. But that wasn't the kind of festival we were going for. So this equation of Woodstock and the Nimbin Aquarius Festival is a bit species, yeah? We're inspired by the youth culture, but not by the form of the culture. We wanted to do something that would get people working together as a community, yeah? And feeling their way. So what worked for us? Well, we went around, with the election of the Whitlam government, they created the Australian Council for the Arts, yeah? A funding body, the first time a funding body for arts development in Australia. It was all new when we were looking for money for the Aquarius Festival. And literally, Johnny Allen and I walked around the offices of the Australian Council, going to visit the various heads of the different boards, the crafts board, the music board, the theatre board, all this kind of stuff, saying, we've got this great idea for a festival, how can you help us? Right? Saying. It was so loose at that time that these project officers who had access to this money would say, oh, I've got a great idea for it. And they would write the grant application for us, right? So we didn't have to argue it. They would find the money for their ideas. And one of those ideas was from the music board director, was to bring a tight wire walker, Philippe Petit from France. He'd seen him perform at a festival and thought he was terrific, right? The ticket, the money was arranged overnight. The Film and Television Board had been created, and we said what we wanted to do, one of the great ideas would be to explore community television, yeah? And this was particularly cable television, where you would hook a community up with a cable system and they would be their own news, yeah? There'd be people out with cameras. So the idea was that we could create a bush video to do this. It was new technology, half-inch porta-packs. For the first time, you could carry a TV camera with a porta-pack and record on your shoulder, so move into the crowd. We got money, to equip this bunch of guys with not only porta-packs, but also heaps of Super 8 movie footage, film. Super 8 was the cheap man's colour movie making machine. And that we would make these cameras available to anyone who wanted to get out and record the festival. And then we would play the stuff back that evening with a link up in the shop fronts with television monitors, yeah? We never quite got it. With too much cannabis, right? Got confused. But it was a bold experiment at the time and led to a lot of things. The people who were working on that got to be advisors in Telstra and all that kind of stuff. It had major ramifications, even if it didn't fulfil its goals. And the final insult to it was what the group kind of split. You know, they had a big argument, internal argument about what to do with the footage. And one guy stole all the footage, right, of the Super 8 and disappeared with it. So we never saw the fruits of that labour, just one shot of himself, one particular movie. So what's the feeling of the event? Spontaneity. Oh, another theory that we were greatly influenced. It was called de-schooling. It was the idea that schools were, instead of opening people's minds, were narrow, limiting their opportunities. And one of the big challenges of the 21st century would be to de-school, to get people out of the habits of schooling and get them into the habit of learning. Yeah? So the idea of the alternative to schooling was what they called learning exchanges, where you'd set up in your community an information exchange where people could advertise, I want to learn this, you know, I want to learn how to work a chainsaw or something like this. And someone could say, I can teach you that, yeah? I want to learn, I want to teach. No to schools. And that's what we set up in what was across the road there. There's a clothes shop there now. Was a learning exchange. And every day people would go in and chalk up seminars, things they wanted to talk about or wanted to be part of, you know, or wanted to share. But mostly it was sitting around. Yeah. The festival never came together as a single focus until the police busted it on the fourth night. Yeah, I think it was the third night. So what had happened in the promotion of the festival was that we'd managed to evade the corporate media. It happened under the radar. At the 40th anniversary, a guy got up and said, I guess, you know, my feeling of reading the media of the festival was that you were pioneers of the internet, in the sense that although there wasn't an internet, you used the media that was available in a creative way, and we did. I was, as I said, a student editor, so I knew other student editors, and the way we promoted the festival was lips of the counterculture, word of mouth, also backed up with student newspapers, which were acting at the time as the underground press. Yeah? So all our advertising happened through the underground press. It was only noticed by the Sydney Morning Herald like a day before. They ran an article about everyone seems to be going to Nimbin. Who's heard of Nimbin? You know? The first notice in the corporate press. But this led to a kind of resentment. Yeah? So when the police made a bust, and we had an agreement with the police that they would not go into the camping areas, into the fields, without consulting us, knowing how volatile students could be in the front of police harassment. Don't do this without telling us and giving us good warning. They did it. They went and busted someone, a needle user actually, rather than a cannabis user. And in bringing their prisoner, arrested him, in bringing him back towards the police station up Gungus Road, ambushed by the police. The word someone went to the main stage and said, the police are busting the festival. As one, people went and surrounded the van, jostled it. In the course of this, the policeman's gun was taken, the prisoner was released, and the media went wild. And suddenly, hippies riot at Nimbin was the headline in the afternoon press. You know? So the government was going to respond, and how they respond was to send what was, that time, it was the tactical response squad, what they called it, the riot squad of today. They were called the 21st Division. But they didn't wear armour, these guys. They were bruisers. They were the guys that were sent in to beat up prisoners. During prison riots, they were sent in just to thump people. Oh, they were thugs. Policemen's thugs. And they arrived in town on the fourth day, and I realised what they were going to do, you know, the festival organiser. They were going to bust the festival. They were going to go into the fields and break heads. That was their revenge for the taking of the gun. And so there were a meeting was called in the police station at my suggestion, and with the heads of the Australian Union of Students. And the last minute I said, we need some local voices here. And I thought, I'll get Dave Smith. Dave Smith used to own the dairy farm with its gate opening towards the butter factory down there. The prime dairy farm in the Nimbin Valley was owned by Dave Smith. His sister owned this block of land. Their father had bought up dairy farms as they went bust all around the country. And Dave Smith had become a friend of the festival. He was also the local National Party organiser. He was also the leader in the Masonic Lodge down the road there. He was a man of great influence, right? And he'd come on board partly because he wanted to liquidate his properties. He saw the hippies as being a potential market. But he was a supporter of what we were doing. He really enjoyed women swimming naked in the creek. He used to go down with his horse, and naked women would ride his horse and all this kind of stuff. He felt mightily fulfilled. So I invited him to this showdown with the cops. And the cops were with the head, the local superintendent was there, and also head of the 21st Division. Head of the 21st Division was saying, no way, you have no rights in this town, blah, 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 blah. And the police will do what's required to bring law and order to this. And 3 times we went through it and said, if you go down into the fields, there will be a riot. There are women and children down there. People are going to be injured. We must do what we must do. Right? So finally I turned to Dave Smith and say, what do you think about this, Dave? Dave said, I think if you go down into the fields, the police go down to the fields, there'll be property damage. Bing! Property damage turns out to be the key thing that the police didn't want to have happen, right? And they said, okay, blah, 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 blah. But basically they called out the operation.
They got their gun back, right?
They got their gun back, yeah. And the guy that took the gun got pretty badly treated. We didn't support him. It's one of the shames of my organising. I didn't pay more attention to this guy. When he handed in the gun at our request. And anyway, I stepped outside. We'd gone in there about just before sunset, about 5:30. And when we came out, it was dark. But in the yard were like 60 uniformed police. They'd rostered on police from Casino, from the south, from Lismore, to be part of this push. And it was all called off. So the festival had been saved a riot by, thank you, Dave Smith, of property damage. And so what happened, I think, the festival was kind of split after that between the radicals who said we should have confronted the police there and then. Let's have it out. Many left the festival. Other people said, and this is the major, some of the images you'll see here is a big meeting. And that was the image. Whether we fought the police or we just yielded. This was very Taoist, not to confront. Right? Let the festival continue. Let the love and peace and joy win the way. Well, love and peace and joy were the people that prevailed. And within a couple of days, within 2 days, right, the 21st Division's tactics mellowed. They ceased being aggressive. They began to relax in the streets of Nimbin. This is the meeting, the big meeting. Here's President of the Australian Union of Students. This is Johnny Allen. Here's me with beard. The big meeting decided how we'd respond to the police. Yeah? So love and peace prevailed. The 21st Division was mellowed. They ceased to be aggressive. And come the great sports day on the Sunday, the second last day of the festival, which Doug Anthony attended, there was a tug of war between the straights and the hippies. But we also put a challenge out to the police. This challenge is being reenacted today at the Mardi Gras with the tug of war with the police. And particularly the 21st Division. Anyway, the 21st Division were told they weren't allowed to demean themselves by tugging war. But they gave us this information with great regret, because they really did want to be part of the tug of war. And instead we had a tug of war between the farmers. This is Johnny Allen looking exhausted. We were both burned out by the time we got to the festival. Organising hippies is like organising cats, herding cats. It was a nightmare. By the time we got to the first night of the festival, Johnny couldn't speak anymore. He'd lost his voice, laryngitis. And I couldn't hear. People would speak at me, and I could hear the individual words, but they didn't frame anything in my mind. Once they stopped speaking, I couldn't remember what they'd said. There was no more space in my mind to take in more information. Thanks. I had to go and rest. And I didn't come back into the festival as an organiser until the riot. Trying to sort that out. So that was a festival, mainly living together, right? And this was part of my sociology at the time. What I had noticed, the big question for me was what was going to create cultural movement in these times? How do we create a culture of peace out of a culture of war? Yeah? How do we create this kind of movement? Well, what I began to notice when I went to these protests in Sydney, I was based at Sydney University, was that the protests weren't about the speakers on the main stage, right? These were usually controlled by left-wing factions of various kinds doing deals, right, of what was allowed to be said from the microphone. Now, the real importance of the festival for me was its, how can I say, its sociological phenomenon. That is, people were there, seeing each other in public place, sharing common cause, right? And unlike the old lefties, we wanted to dance, yeah? We wanted to be flamboyant. We wanted to occupy the public space with our spirits, with our hearts, yeah? So I got a big insight for me from there. In all my organising of anti-war stuff, anti-conscription, anti-war rallies that came, were always accompanied with music, yeah? I would always have a band to lighten the atmosphere, always have a song going. So the festival was kind of an extension of this, to create a gathering where people would share, yeah? Not get talked at, but would live the culture. So it's the idea of festivals creating temporary communities. Yeah? You come together and you live together and you share your values. Yeah? That's what creates cultural movement. It's not rational. We're herd animals. Yeah? We have this elaborate emotional structure that responds irrationally, irrationally, feeling part of a herd. Yeah? That was what the festival created. Right? It planted many dreams. One of the common things said about it, for example, Chris Dean is famous on the North Coast. He lives over at Byron Bay. He founded Thursday Plantation and started distilling tea tree oil at Corokai. He came to the festival, and the things that affirmed him was that he looked around and realised there were lots of people just like him, feeling and thinking the same sort of stuff. Yeah? He realised there was mass in this. So this gave him confidence to go away and set up this still and create this amazing essential oil industry. He's a major, now he's running Organics India in India, setting up organic farming enterprise over in India. He's a guru. It was this sense of being part of a larger community that gave him the confidence to do that work. Yeah? This is what festivals can do, yeah? When they're not hijacked by ego-tripping musicians. Yeah? You can create this sense of how the world could be. So that was the effect of the Aquarius Festival. People went back to the universities, went home. A lot of them, we attracted a lot of people who weren't students, of course. And in the university, there were notices, for example, at Sydney University, after Nimbin what? Yeah? People wanted to come up together and talk about how the world could be. What are we going to do now we've experienced this? We've seen these options for living. A lot of them decided they would come back to Nimbin, yeah? And see if they could turn these dreams into social realities, yeah? Enduring social realities. A lot of them changed their courses. For example, the impact of the Aquarius Festival on the Sydney Architecture School. Most of these structures you've seen here were built by architect students from Col James. He encouraged them to come along and experiment, develop the site. They built bridges, they built shelters using natural materials. The impact on the Sydney University Architecture School was to go low-tech. Up to that time, architecture was all about building high-rises. Yeah? The most splendid office in Sydney. That was the ambition of every architect, to have a tower in Sydney. After Nimbin, they said, no, we want to talk about shelter. low-cost shelter. How do we house Aboriginals, for example? Yeah? How do we find technologies that don't burn up the earth and its resources? How can we use local materials to make shelters? Mud brick and all those kind. Alternative technology took off big time. A whole generation of architect students changed direction with the Aquarius Festival. Yeah? Also alternative technology. Yeah? We're just solar energy today was all born in this time. This is when they began talking about it. The alternative technology workshops. These are the architects building bridges out of bamboo, local bamboo and trunk. Yeah? Yeah, across the creeks. So that was the effect of the Aquarius Festival, the cultural impact. And it's been described by such as, I can't remember his name, the guy who used to have the Four Corners, hosted the Four Corners program. After his retirement was asked significant events in Australian cultural history during his time. And he named the Aquarius Festival as one of the top four influences on Australian culture at the time. But you've got to understand, when you see this footage, see how sparse it was. Yeah? When people equate it with the Woodstock Festival, when you got 500,000 people turning up, it wasn't like that. Yeah? Maybe 2,000 people max. We said 5,000 at the time, we were exaggerating. But when you see the old footage, you see there are never any great crowd gatherings. This is the Nimbin Festival, right? The Aquarius Festival. Hardly anyone, yeah? Compared to the Mardi Gras, for example. Yeah? This is its impact was that it planted dreams. It had enough concentration, enough mind-blowing ideas, the right combination of mushrooms and reality, you know, to make people incredibly receptive, yeah? Open to new directions in their lives. That's what happened. Yeah? And of course people stayed on after the festival. I came back 2 years later and we started seriously organising community cultural development. I came back with a group of people, we called ourselves the Reality Construction Company. Our object was to turn dreams into social realities. Yeah? So all the dreams of the Aquarius Festival, how do we make them enduring cultural practice? Yeah? What was in our favour was that the Aquarius Festival had acquired property in the main street, Birth and Beyond, the Rainbow Cafe, what is now the Hemp Embassy, were all acquired at that time. So we had shop fronts in the main street of Nimbin. We were a presence in the main street of Nimbin. And when people began buying land and establishing communities, there are 60 MOs in the Lismore area, right? The higher concentration anywhere else in Australia. This gave us the critical mass, yeah, to allow these ideas to take root as community practice and evolve. Yeah? So Nimbin is much more today than it was, say, in 1975, right? Directly after the festival, because these ideas about alternative education, or talk about education. Yeah? I had children, young children. I went to see what the school was like, the Nimbin Public School. I went to a P&C meeting. I couldn't believe it. These great big farmers with great big bums and great big legs from walking up and down hills, sitting in primary school kids' chairs, yeah, behind primary school kids' tables, all lined up with the headmaster up the front telling them how it was going to be. This was a P&C committee meeting. And what they were there in force was, they wanted to block any influences from the hippies on their school. Yeah? That's why they'd rallied that night at that P&C committee. What happened, right? We formed our own school, the Nimbin Community School, and started teaching their new ideas, alternatives in education. And the effect of this was that the primary school was forced with downgrade because the hippies weren't bringing their kids to the school. So the school changed. And not only changed radically, and became this organisation. Yeah? Was one of the leaders in teaching in the area, certainly when Margie Hayes was involved, you know, the principal. They tried lots of plans to engage the parents. They were much more open. So we changed the school. The hospital, for example. When we arrived in Nimbin, the hospital was actually closed. They couldn't get a doctor to man it. Yeah? The last doctor had left town, so they closed the door of the hospital. So we approached the hospital, knowing we're going to need, for the festival, we're going to need health facilities. We approached the hospital. We had with us my friends Harry Freeman, one of the supporters of the festival, took on the job of opening the hospital. So he went and negotiated with the base hospital in Lismore that if he provided the staff, the nursing and the doctor's staff, could we have the hospital open for the festival? They agreed, and the hospital hasn't closed its doors since that time. Yeah? In fact, it's expanded. Yeah? So Nimbin was imploding. Suddenly it started flowering. Yeah? Services came back. These are some of the impacts of the festival. And of course then the tourism. Nimbin very quickly became known in the 70s as the counterculture capital of Australia. Yeah? Much more so than Maynarm and Mullumbimby. Nimbin, and before Byron Bay was a meatworks town. You know, you wouldn't go to Byron Bay, it stank. You know? You might go there for a surf, but you wouldn't stay around. Nimbin was the place where it was happening, and radicals from Sydney, you know, for example, Wendy Bacon, were organising campaigns to stop the destruction of heritage housing in the green bands in Sydney. Used to use Nimbin as rest and recreation, to come out to get out of the city and bring their ideas up here. So culture, you know, began at that time. But the murals, right, also distinguished it. Benny Zabel and the painting of the murals.
Was Benny at the festival?
Benny was zany bubbles in those days. He was a dancer, not so much a painter. He became a painter in Nimbin, right? You know, he began, you know, just before them. He was a dancer to that time. Any questions? I've been talking to. Well, let me affirm that we didn't have any rain right through April, through to May, and the rain didn't come until it started breaking down the festival. And the locals said how lucky we were. And of the curse, well, as I said before, we were promoting, our catchword for promoting the festival had been, the good news would travel on the lips of the counterculture. It was such a great idea that you want to tell your fellow hippies that it was happening, yeah? That was our plan. But then we heard about this curse. This is my story. That the valley was cursed. There'd been a massacre somewhere in the fields of the festival, and nothing would prosper while this curse was in place. Well, the other side of good news, bad news travels much faster than good news, right? So I'm aware that this curse just took off. And there were people like Bar Stone running around the village and saying, we've got to change the location, of the valleys. I was more interested in finding out where the curse came from, right? Because none of the people I'd spoken to mentioned it before. So I went looking. I went asking. I went to Gundarimba. I'd never heard of Gundarimba before this. There were I've been confronted, this is my story, I've been confronted by an Aboriginal land rights activist who I understood to be Gary Foley at the Australian Union Students' Conference when we'd done the presentation. He came up to me afterwards and said, have you asked the local Bunzalan about this festival? It never occurred to me to ask the local Bunzalan. I'd seen no Aboriginals at all in my wandering. No mention had been made. There were no, as far as I know, right, and I did a lot of, there were no Aboriginals living in the Nimbin Valley at the time of the Aquarius Festival. So I went to Gundarimba and I asked around. They recommended I go and speak to an elder, Uncle Lyle, out at Woodenbong. So I made the journey to Woodenbong, yeah, and found the address, and it was a bit of Canberra, public housing at the edge of Woodenbong, brick apartments, and asked the first person. She looked at me, that Aboriginal woman looked at me doubtfully and said, that's his place over there, Uncle Lyle's place. Looked at me doubtfully. I thought, wow, what's going on? knocked on the door. The curtains were shabby, you know, they were torn and dirty. Right? And when the door, I heard a rumbling inside, and he answered my knock, the door opened, there was a blast of foul air came out. You know what a stale, when people locked up in a room without ventilation smells like, multiplied by 10. And then this man appeared in front of the door, groggy, and suppurating sores, running sores on his leg. He was just in a terrible state. You know, I was just appalled. If this was an elder, you know, what was happening to the Aboriginal people? So I asked him best I could, but all I got out of him was ravings. You know, he was alcoholic dementia. And he talked about, Jesus quotes the divine thing, you know. There are parallels between pain. So I realised this guy, the curse certainly wasn't known to this man. Yeah? And he didn't respond in any rational way on. So where was the curse coming from? I sort of guessed it must have been coming from the activists down in Melbourne. I thought it must have offended Gary Foley or something like this. So I knew it was coming from out of town. Turned out to be from Melbourne. A guy called Jerry Bostock had created this rumour. He'd read about the festival in an article in what was called a paper that was produced in Melbourne at that time. And he was Bunjalung, and he claimed to know about this curse, and he wrote this up. He knew nothing about the festival. He knew nothing about what was happening in Nimbin at the time, and he just dished it out of hand. So the curse, my story of the curse is that it was a false rumour. Yeah? But the hippies were so eager to hear it and make it part of their culture that it had transport anyway. I quickly learned that once a rumour like that starts, there's nothing you can do about it. There was a rumour going around with me. My name's Dunstan, right? Don Dunstan was the Premier of South Australia. And I would always get this question, are you a son of Don Dunstan? Because it was assumed by the National Party that Don Dunstan had sent up his son to undermine the National Party in this area. So it happened. At that big meeting I talked to you about in the Nimbin Hall, the first question that was put to me about this great idea was, are you a son of Don Dunstan? Mm-hmm. Forever. People are still asking.
Yeah,
I'm not, by the way. These are these saunas that were built by the architect students who reasoned that the thing about saunas is that they don't require a lot of water and you don't have to worry about the drainage so much. You don't create mud piles. And so they put together these saunas with fire on the outside here and heating water and blah, blah, blah. There were two of them. And they became great scenes where people would crowd in together naked, right? Stoke up the water, throw water on the fire so it was like steaming hot, and then break out all in a mass and run outside and, you know, get cool. The festival was being tracked by this time by the Northern Star, running daily articles. And so we were getting a lot of day visitors, people coming out in cars and buses. They would line up outside the sauna to be appalled. Oh, this is terrible. We were a tourist attraction. Yeah.
I saw a headline, festival, hygiene worries and that sort of thing.
Hygiene worries, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you, in those, this was the days of Terania Shire. So we were a subject being run by the Terania Shire. And Terania Shire was a small local government organisation that didn't have a lot of resources. But the resources that they did have, having the community having backed the festival, the Shire thought its responsibility was to back the community. You know? So they gave us, effectively, their engineer and their health inspector. They were on site, you know, helping us organise the drainage, helping us get the toilets right? It's not as if we were doing it against the law. We had their support, hands-on. Not like you'd have from Lismore City Council. They'd give you directives and make it conditional, right? And then go and inspect to see if you've done it. They wouldn't do anything to help you. Old Terania Shire, they were in there helping us.